Now let's get initial reaction to the recording and the documents from MPs. Conservative Erin O'Toole joins us from Toronto, and in Ottawa we have Liberal Mark Miller and Nathan Cullen for the NDP here in studio. Mr. O'Toole, I'll go to you first. This is all happening very quickly, and we haven't had a whole lot of time to absorb this, but what is your initial reaction to this phone call recording?
Well, it's extraordinary, Glenn. It certainly shows us why the Trudeau government has been working around the clock the last few weeks to block Ms. Wilson-Raybould from telling the full story, to being able to rebut some of the evidence from the key Trudeau figures. Certainly, it suggests that the Prime Minister and his key figures have not been truthful to Parliament. They've been shutting down the committee process. They're showing an absolute contempt for Parliament. They're besmirching the name of Ms. Wilson-Raybould. We'll probably hear the Liberal attacks here on the program. I think it's getting into a point where there's no confidence in the Prime Minister, and we're going to have to act in that regard.
Mr. Cullen, the government has maintained all along that these conversations were appropriate. There was nothing wrong said, that this is part of the process, that cabinet ministers talk amongst themselves about policy. How does this recording change your view of that, if at all?
Well, I think it confirms a number of things that we heard from Ms. Wilson-Raybould at committee. She had very specific quotes. She had an exact reasoning for her logic in terms of what the law said. And what struck me, a couple of things. One is we need a public inquiry. This constant delay and stall at the Justice Committee is not going to get to the truth that we need of this matter. Secondly, that she actually, several times in that audio recording, if you listen to the whole thing, which I have, she says, I'm trying to protect the Prime Minister.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. Like she's actually playing defense here, it sounds like.
She says several times, does he understand what he's asking for? Because what they're asking for, what Wernick is asking for in these audio tapes and these text messages of conversations with Gerald Butts and all these senior people around Trudeau, what Trudeau was asking for was political interference in a criminal proceeding. That to overrule the independent department that makes decisions as to who goes to trial and how. And they're saying, interfere. And she says, no. And they keep the pressure on. She tells them to stop. She says, this is inappropriate. I'm trying to protect the Prime Minister here and governance. And they continue on. And then at the very end of the call, if you listen right to the end, she says, because he keeps saying the Prime Minister's determined, and she says, I know he usually gets what he wants. Something to that effect. I have the quote not exactly right. Mr. Wernick doesn't contradict that. And she says, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, which dropped a month and a bit later when she was removed as Attorney General.
Right, for whatever reason. We're not 100% sure yet still, but
it's clear the reason.
Started to connect the dots, right?
Like several months of pressure, she resists the pressure. He says the Prime Minister's in a determined state of mind, and then a month later she's fired when she doesn't give in to that pressure.
He said one way or another.
You'd have to be pretty thick not to connect it.
Right, okay, but Mr. Miller, I understand you haven't heard the entire audio recording, so in fairness though, from what you've heard of that excerpt, is there anything in there to support her claim that she was subject to veiled threats? And is there anything also in there that contradicts what so far the government defense has been, that this was all part and parcel of a normal way of doing business?
Well, look, Glenn, it shouldn't escape your listeners that my colleagues have already teed up the dots before they heard this layer of evidence. But what I have been able to tease out at first glance is that I don't see any particularly new evidence. I see the salacious nature of a recording, as well as some clarifications of the facts that were provided by Ms. Wilson-Raybould. What it does confirm is that at the end of the day, you have two sides who profoundly believe that they did their respective jobs, and both confirm that nothing illegal has occurred. So we're in a situation where you've got a lot of political spin. The committee has had ample opportunity to hear 4 hours of testimony from Ms. Wilson-Raybould, equivalent amounts of time from what we qualify as the other side. But both sides presenting evidence. Evidence and testimony has been compelling, but as Ms. Wilson-Raybould herself says, she doesn't believe that the formal process should be carried forward anymore. So I would leave it at that. But again, Canadians will make up their minds about this.
She say the process shouldn't continue? She has to come back to the committee.
Page 19.
Yes, but she has
page 19.
Excuse me. Hold on a second. You can say what you'd like here. Ms. Wilson-Raybould wrote to the Justice Committee and said, there's more that I need to say.
Right.
And the Liberals on the Justice Committee said no. Then we went to the Ethics Committee to try to over an opportunity there for my Liberal colleagues to allow full testimony. They said no. Mr. Wernick went in front of committee and said the following, that SNC never threatened to move, that SNC was not putting that on the table. In this phone call, I just heard Mr. Warnick's voice say, SNC, from all of our information, has told us that they're threatening to move. Then we had the Prime Minister say they were going to get rid of all the jobs. Then the head of SNC comes forward and says, I never told the Prime Minister or his senior officials that.
But the company did release clarification on that. That said, in fact, that, and there were apparently documents to support
Forgive Canadians for saying, what the hell's going on?
Yeah.
What is going on when you have a Prime Minister and his senior officials pressuring the independent Attorney General to do something that she clearly says that the law does not direct her to do? They said, do it anyways. Yeah.
Now, we're still processing, obviously, the content of this and comparing it against previous testimony and that sort of thing. That's going to take a couple hours and maybe days. But Aaron O'Toole, I want to talk to you about the form that this takes. A cabinet minister who admits that it's inappropriate for her to do this, to go in and make a covert recording of her conversation with the highest ranking public servant in the country, and now releasing this. What's your reaction to that? Is this case compelling enough that she should do that and possibly break? I don't know if it's a break of solicitor-client privilege, but there'll be debates about that for sure in coming hours and days. But what do you think of people making those covert recordings of high-level conversations?
Well, look, Mr. Wernick was not her client, so that's a ruse that the Liberals are putting out there. There's been a steady and systemic character assassination of Jody Wilson-Raybould by the Liberals, by former Liberals like Sheila Copps, Don Johnson, who sat in Trudeau's father's cabinet, suggesting she didn't understand what the words national economic interest meant, suggesting she needed a Supreme Court of Canada opinion to try and basically suggest to Ms. Wilson-Raybould that her legal judgment wasn't sound. It's horrific for someone who preached sunny ways and suggested that he was going to empower his cabinet ministers. This showed a very concerning trend with the Trudeau government, who've lied to Canadians, I think, with respect to this scandal. Remember, Mr. Wernick said the story in the Globe and Mail that broke this entire scandal was not true. Well, here on the recording, even someone with no legal training can hear that every time Mr. Wernick responded to Jody Wilson-Raybould on the tape, it was yes, but. The Prime Minister's in that type of mood. He's going to get it done one way or another. The emails to and texts her chief of staff received, her chief of staff was actually intimidated by Jerry Butts, who said to her directly, there will be interference in this case. So this is a travesty, Glenn. In fact, it shows a contempt for Parliament. The legislative process has been interrupted in terms of committee work. Clearly, the Attorney General of Canada was both intimidated by the Prime Minister's team. I think that might be the next step. Mark seems to think there's nothing illegal here. This is unconstitutional and a violation of the Parliament of Canada Acts, and I think the Prime Minister's in contempt.
Well, we'll just respond to Mr. Miller's comments that there doesn't seem to be anything illegal done. In fact, the Attorney General herself at committee said she didn't think anything illegal was done. What is it about the recordings that you've heard that suggests that Mr. Wernick was wrong, that these conversations, while they may have been talking to her a lot about this, transgressed from the kind of conversations you have in caucus all the time to the point where it was either illegal or inappropriate?
Well, there's the Constitution itself, which separates the executive branch, legislative, and judicial. So there's constitutional problems here when the executive branch is actually pressuring and interfering in a prosecution. The Parliament of Canada Act, I think, has also been violated in terms of illegalities around this. The Shawcross doctrine demonstrates where the line is. They drove over the line, Glenn, in September, and here you have Jody Wilson-Raybould essentially pleading with the clerk. I'm trying to protect the Prime Minister. Has anyone explained to him what this means? It's clear. This is where we see Mr. Trudeau's arrogance coming out from time to time, where he wants his way. As the clerk said, he's in one of those moods. So the sunny ways Prime Minister doesn't act that way behind closed doors, and that's what the tape showed us today.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Mark here. You now have a caucus colleague who was taping at least one conversation, which she may have taped. Well, she says this was the only time she's ever done this, so we take her at her word on that. But are you comfortable sitting in caucus with somebody who is doing that and now releasing that tape?
Well, look. First, I've had more heated conversations with the Prime Minister as a simple caucus member. Certainly, other caucus members have had it. The tone and nature of this interaction did not seem as heavy as it has been purported to be. Perhaps Mr. O'Toole, when he was in government, didn't feel at liberty to have those discussions with Mr. Harper. But I know that Mr. Trudeau is very open to these conversations and enjoys them and enjoys the back and forth. And that's what we expect from a Prime Minister that is the leader of a G7 country. As to the tape, look, I do find it just distressing that a colleague would go to lengths to tape a conversation with what is effectively Canada's highest bureaucrat,
and not just make the tape, but to release it now.
Well, look, she was responding to I won't impute her motive. She was responding to a request from Mr. Rankin, and she probably thought that it was salient to the request. I'll give her the benefit of the doubt to that. But certainly, if this were about me, there would be a trust issue. And clearly, this is something that I'm going to have discussions with her in caucus.
You'll have a caucus meeting next week.
And I would expect caucus mates to also address that as well.
You expect a vote at caucus about whether she can stay in caucus next week?
What happens in caucus will remain for the purposes
Would you like to see a vote in caucus
of the
next week?
Westminster system in caucus?
Would you like to see a vote in caucus next week?
Glenn, I'm going to reserve judgment for my caucus mates. It would be premature and indeed inappropriate for me to discuss this on a national news
Real quick, 30 seconds, Nathan. What happens next now?
I'd hope to see if they want to actually see the end of this at some point. The Liberals have been saying from the beginning this was false, this wasn't true, no pressure was applied, and then we find out drip, drip, drip. The scandal continues. Trudeau's polling numbers drop, and they say, what? They keep reinventing. It was Scott Bryson's fault. Right. A public inquiry would go a long way. I think Ms. Wilson-Raybould answers the question as to why it was taped, because she was getting increasingly worried. She says it herself. I didn't do this normally, and now I had to do this because I was getting pressured, and I was telling them, stop it, and they kept doing it.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Mark Miller, Nathan Cullen, and Aaron O'Toole in Toronto, thanks for coming in and talking to us about this. We'll have more on